There is a certain image of Britain. It's the Britain of Brideshead Revisited, of Mr. Darcy's house, Pemberley, in Pride and Prejudice. It's the Britain of cucumber sandwiches, croquet and tea on the lawn. But the country house isn't just a bastion of elegant living. These houses were at the very heart of Britain's political, economic and cultural life. The country house is genuinely a phenomenon that doesn't have a parallel in terms of European architectural history. And it tells us an enormous amount about the way we developed as a nation. In Britain, the monarchy was weak and the aristocracy was strong. So while our kings languished in crumbling medieval houses, the aristocracy lived in shiny new palaces. The country house was the centre of our national story for at least 200 years. From 1530 to 1750, Britain's history took a different course to much of Europe. Other nations became absolute monarchies. Power in Britain uniquely rested not only with the king, but with Parliament, which was controlled by the great men of the counties and shires. These aristocrats were kings in their own little countries, and they displayed and cemented that power through building. In the Middle Ages, great lords built castles. But from the time of the Tudors, they wanted to show off not military might, but a less brutish and more polite kind of taste. They built a new kind of building, the country house. Vast resources went into their construction. They were the cathedrals of their time. The story of the country house is one of the things that sets our architectural history apart from the rest of Europe. In many ways, it's the history of 18th century Britain in brick and stone. This is Stowe House in Buckinghamshire, and it represents the climax of the country house. It's a corporate headquarters, an advertisement, and an art gallery, all rolled into one. I think there is a sense in which, if you want to understand 18th century Britain, you've got to understand the country house.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is really the culmination of so much that has gone before in terms of this magnificent building, a work of art in itself, being the centre of artistic activity, political activity, social activity. You came here to be seen, to plot, to further your career, to have dalliances, all those kinds of things. And yeah, this is absolutely it, the centre of life in 18th century Britain.
And here at Stowe, I think you see it better than anywhere else, because this is a palace. There's no other word for it. I mean, this is where all the wealth and power of the nation is concentrated for a few years at the end of the 18th century.
Oh, yes, absolutely. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. Particularly compared to, say, the royal palaces in London. If you think about where the king was living at the time, it was absolutely nothing like this, nowhere near as splendid.
Between 1530 and 1750, over 700 country houses were built across Britain. To trace their origins, we need to go back to the Middle Ages, to the moment when architects dropped military styles and started to make houses more comfortable to live in. I've come here to Haddon Hall in Derbyshire, because here you have a house that uniquely was abandoned in the 18th century. The owners moved elsewhere, fossilising it as it was. And what that allows us to see here is the way a great house evolved over a period of 300 years to the 16th century. In about 1200, Haddon was a jumble of unconnected buildings. At its centre was the Great Hall, surrounded by a kitchen, a watchtower and a chapel. The hall was the heart of the house, where the Lord, his family, and their servants spent their time together as companions. This is really one of the best surviving medieval great halls in England, and I think tells us a huge amount about the way a medieval household worked.
It would have been the room where the family would have dined, where the household would have congregated, and very much been the centre of life here. There would have been probably long benches at which people would have sat, and as with all halls of the medieval period, there was a high end to the hall, the dais end, where the lord and his family would have sat.
So what happens in this house is there are a series of single standalone buildings
Yes.
that are gradually joined up to make the two courtyards we know today.
That's right, joining up hall, chapel, kitchen, lodgings for retainers and guests when they came to the house.
At the high end, there is a staircase.
Yes.
And that staircase eventually leads on to the other rooms.
Exactly, yes.
It was 1450, and Haddon was developing towards the house that we see today. First one, then more new rooms were added to the hall. It was a first taste of a precious commodity, privacy. Now, this room, I think one would want to call the Great Chamber, the big room at the back of the hall.
Yes, a room like this was the beginning of a process of the building of sequences of rooms away from the hall.
The sort of life you were living as a great magnate was fundamentally different to the life you were living when that hall was first built.
Yes, in rooms like this, the lord would have carried out his estate business, he would have dined.
And in the 15th century, for instance, do you think that he'd have slept in here, perhaps?
He may well have done, but increasingly from this time, the lord would have had a separate bedroom and an apartment.
We don't usually think of the bedroom as an invention, but houses like Haddon reflected a new way of living, different rooms for different functions. It was the birth of a more modern kind of house. But Haddon took 300 years to build. New rooms were added to old haphazardly. It was charming chaos. The next generation of houses would be more ordered, more symmetrical, and would drop the vestiges of medieval design. The time of the country house had come. For 4 centuries after the Norman Conquest, the largest and most spectacular buildings had been churches. Cathedrals and monasteries had dominated the land. In the 1530s, it was all swept away. The Reformation saw all 800 monasteries in England close down. Henry VIII took their vast wealth and embarked on a spending spree. He entertained lavishly, he fought wars, and he built over 60 palaces, of which, astonishingly, only Hampton Court survives. Many of the great monasteries with their valuable estates were sold to the aristocracy. In the early days, they just moved in. This is Laycock Abbey in Wiltshire, a perfect symbol of what was going on. The family who bought this abbey's lands built themselves some fine rooms above the cloisters and created an instant country house. Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558. In her immensely long reign, she built not a single major palace. She was tight with her money. She got her courtiers to build for her. Most years, she would go on tour to a series of great houses with her court, at vast expense to her hosts. Should she deign to descend, there was nothing more important than getting it right, to the point of bankruptcy. Elizabeth wanted and needed the aristocracy to pay. The Elizabethan nobility, made rich by farming, trade and public office, embarked on a huge building spree, creating houses of a size and in a style never seen before. A royal visit was the ultimate in prestige, but a house of royal proportions marked out a family as rulers of their area. One of the finest of these Tudor show homes was back in Derbyshire. Although this building is only about 10 minutes' drive away from Haddon Hall, it's actually a million miles away in terms of architectural style and its ambition. It was built by one of the most remarkable people of the Elizabethan age. It is Hardwicke Hall. Elizabeth, Countess of Shrewsbury, known as Bess of Hardwicke, had spectacularly married her way to money. She threw herself into building, but she didn't get it right first time. And the ruins of her earlier house can tell us a lot about what she was trying to achieve. It's incredibly unusual, if not unique, to have these two buildings next door to each other. The old hall, which is her sort of first go at getting it right, and the new hall. I mean, it tells us an awful lot, doesn't it?
It does. This is a really unusual opportunity, actually, to compare and contrast both houses, both built within a fairly short span of time by one very dominating personality.
And she was rich. She was very rich.
She was super rich, definitely. She was a close friend of Queen Elizabeth. She was an aristocrat. She'd married extraordinarily well. She was careful with her money, but she chose to spend it on building.
She was genuinely interested in architecture, wasn't she?
Yes, she'd had a lot of experience over her lifetime, and she was not a complete beginner when she came back to Hardwicke. But I think the point about coming back to Hardwicke is that she was coming back to her roots. Hardwicke was her birthplace. It was her father's historic family estate, and she came back to it towards the end of her life, really. And I think she was really setting down a marker for what she saw the future of her family, her descendants.
But looking at the new hall, Queen Elizabeth built nothing on this sort of scale, of this elaboration. I mean, this is an extraordinary situation, isn't it?
Well, I think Elizabeth was very keen that her courtiers would spend on her behalf, particularly when she went travelling around the countryside, and would expect to stay in the greatest possible comfort. And we simply don't know whether Bess ever had ambitions that she too would one day be host to Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth never came here, but had she done so, she would have been received quite royally, I think.
It does seem extraordinary, standing in the old hall, that this building could have just been junked for a new building. I mean, what was wrong with it?
I think Bess probably realised that it had taken her several goes to get this house the way she wanted it to be, but I think we would have to agree with her now that the exterior probably let it down.
This wasn't a mistake Bess would make with her new house. She called in Robert Smithson, England's most famous architect. In designing this house, Bess of Hardwicke and Robert Smithson were designing it from the outside in. It's all about external show. There's a great amount of time and effort spent in getting the external forms right. And there's a little saying that I'm very fond of, which says, Hardwicke Hall, more glass than wall. And you can see it. It's actually almost like a sort of modernist building in the way there's a sort of graph paper pattern of stone and glass as we look at it. If you're driving past on the M1 and you glimpse up and see this wonderful house, it appears like a very big building. But actually, it's not such a big building. When you actually get into it, it's effectively an 8-room house. There's a great hall, there's a gallery, and 2 sets of apartments, 3 each. What's actually important about this is not its size, but about its perfection. It's a jewel, and when you walk around it, even today, hundreds of years later, you're walking around the most perfect expression of Elizabethan architecture to have come down to us. Crucially, Hardwicke Hall abandoned the inward-looking courtyard plan of earlier years for an outward-looking solid block, a modern-style house. Hardwicke was to be a theatre. It delivers the visitor into the presence of Bess as the culmination of an awe-inspiring architectural experience. First, of course, a great hall. Once the destination, now it was just a beginning. Although stylistically this room was up to date, its function actually was very traditional. It was in here that Bess of Hardwicke's servants would have eaten. And if you were a visitor, you'd have entered in through the half-eaten debris, perhaps, of the servant's meal. But the joy of this house, for me, is the staircase. The staircase, which is the beginning of a processional route that takes you from the hall towards the grandest rooms in the whole house. Because Bess had been able to design this house from scratch, it all fitted together, making the visitor ever more conscious as they got closer of just how important this woman was that they were about to meet. At this first landing level, we enter the rooms which Bess of Hardwicke would have normally lived in, through this door. But of course, the staircase carries on. And that's because there was a difference between her everyday rooms and her rooms of state. We see some of the extraordinary theatricality of this processional route, because the staircase at this point twists round.
You can't see what's ahead of you. As you reach the top floor, the anticipation reaches a climax.
And so here, on the top landing, we're about to enter the high great chamber, and you know you're about to enter an important room, because over the door are the arms of Bess of Hardwicke herself. And here we are, in the best preserved and most important surviving Elizabethan stateroom in England.
At last, we come into the presence of Bess herself, and the house leaves us in no doubt that she is the source of power at the heart of Hardwicke Hall.
In here, in this room, she would have sat behind a great table. She would have had her dinner here, and the food would have been brought up 2 floors and been served to her by her servants on bended knee.
There was one room at Hardwicke even more astonishing than the Great Chamber, and it was a uniquely Tudor invention.
The Long Gallery. This astonishing room must have been at the heart of the design of this house. It's not only the largest room in the house, it's the largest long gallery in England. Not the longest, but the largest. And it is an astonishing room. 2 huge fireplaces, the original tapestries hanging on the wall. In here, Bess and her friends could walk on rainy days, could look out of the window and see her estates, the gardens, and watch the sun flooding in through this almost solid wall of glass.
The whole building exists to create this awe-inspiring experience, and at its heart, Bess herself. What Hardwicke demonstrates is how architecture can be used to proclaim power. That's what country houses were for. Bess was the most important woman in England after the Queen, and this house proved it, glittering in the sunlight, screaming "Look at me" to the Derbyshire countryside and to the court far, far beyond.
One thing that I think would surprise us today about Bess of Hardwicke's life here is just how public it was. She had about 30 servants, and in the evenings they wouldn't go back to some tidy servants' quarters put at a distance. They'd actually bed down on a landing like this. They'd unroll their mattress made of straw. In the mornings they'd roll it up again and put it into a chest. That particular way of life, that public way of life where servant and master lived together, was about to change.
Stephen Parisian is at Burghley House in Northamptonshire to trace the radically changing role of servants from Elizabethan times to the 1800s. In the 1580s, when this house was built, there was nothing wrong with being a servant.
Some of the key tasks, things like carver, server, taster, were considered honours. They were allotted not just to any old Tom, Dick or Harry, but to key members of local gentry families. 200 years later, of course, that had all changed, and servants were considered the lowest of the low. I'm going to see exactly how that happened. In the Middle Ages, lords wanted their companions close, as much for protection as bodyguards as for convenience. But as peace broke out across the land, the equation changed. Originally, the place of the master's principal servant was literally at the foot of his master's bed. He had to be close in case he was needed, at least within shouting or handbell distance. And often this was the only private room within the house. The first step down the social ladder the servant took was when he was actually expelled from this room into what was called a pallet room, a little cubby hole off the main space, literally contained a pallet or a mattress and a brazier. No longer was the servant a companion, he was emphatically of the servant's order. Problem was, the only means of access for both master and servant was through the main suite of rooms. And that meant the chamber pots it was their job to empty came through here too. Not something you'd want to bump into on your way back from breakfast. What was needed was a means of getting servants in and out without interfering with the main business of the house. It may not look like it, but I'm now standing in the middle of a major technological breakthrough. Most houses of any size during this period were built round a central courtyard and were just one room thick, looking in and out. Then came the invention of the corridor. This enabled servants to access individual rooms without disturbing the family in the main public areas. New houses were now built with corridors. Old houses, like the one we're in here, had to have corridors inserted. It was difficult, vastly expensive, but it enabled the family to live in the new modern style. As society became more rigid in the 1600s, the gap between master and servant grew into an unbridgeable gulf. This is what servants' quarters look like now. Things are a bit different here, aren't they, from the formal house just a few yards away. Just really underlines the fact that by this time the family wasn't spending money on the staff. By the end of the 18th century, the servants' world was increasingly being hidden from public gaze. You can see how they've done it here. Look, they've actually cut into this priceless old tapestry to make a hidden doorway so the servants could go in and out without being seen. But there is one piece of the puzzle that's missing. As houses got bigger, as lines of communication increased, you couldn't just shout for a servant. So how did master and servant communicate? Well, we've got the answer here. This is another great technological leap forward. It's the simple bell pull. Just a one gentle flick of a ladylike or gentlemanly wrist, and hundreds upon hundreds of yards of wire are operated. Where do they go? Let me show you. Every room in the house would have had the sort of spaghetti of wires you can see exposed up there. Every wire, as you can see there, is labelled so that if one wire was broken or insufficiently taut, then the staff would know which one to repair. And this is where the wires end up, in the servants' hall, with this very impressive array of late Georgian room bells, and indeed its late Victorian successor, an electric version of around 1900. All very impressive, but to a servant of the day, quite terrifying, really, I think, illustrating that the beck and call regime under which they lived. For a servant of the day, bells really would rule their lives. It wasn't just bells. Houses were getting running water, gas light, and eventually electricity. The country house was a technological innovator. But the servants weren't the beneficiaries. In 300 years, the servant had progressed from being bosom buddy to invisible skivvy at the end of a bell pull. In the 16th century, most ranks of society had coexisted in the same house, cheek by jowl. By the 19th century, the admittedly very eccentric aristocrat, the Duke of Portland, threatened to fire any servant he even saw. The mechanisation of the great house had brought with it many, many benefits, but it had created an upstairs-downstairs world in which the servant was very much part of the machine.
During the 17th and 18th centuries, there were enormous changes in the way that people lived in these great houses. But one thing stayed the same, and that was that at heart, these houses were about one thing, and that one thing was power.
By the late 1600s, day-to-day life was becoming more and more of a performance. In a world where everyone had their place in a strict hierarchy, with God at the top and commoners at the bottom, social status was everything. And now every nuance of social standing was expressed in architecture. This was Baroque, flamboyant and theatrical, full of over-the-top decoration. Chatsworth is perhaps the greatest of the English Baroque houses. The man who built it, William Cavendish, was Bess of Hardwicke's great-grandson. He backed the winning side in the Glorious Revolution, which removed the Stuarts from the throne and brought in William of Orange. He completed the social climbing that Bess had begun, and he was made a duke. His house had to be similarly impressive, not the 8 rooms of Hardwicke, but nearly 300.
They're built on an unparalleled scale. Extraordinarily magnificent, lavish use of materials, in fact, grander than any royal palace at the time. But the thing that really stands out for me is that these rooms were never used by the Dukes of Devonshire. They were a status symbol. They were a mini royal palace within a country house, symbolic not only of the Duke's power and influence, but of the power and influence of the monarchy itself.
The state apartments ran in a perfect line along the front of the house. A visitor would know their place by how far they were allowed to penetrate. Here, the full and to us perhaps faintly ludicrous etiquette of the court could be played out in all its glory.
The first room is known as the withdrawing room because the monarch could withdraw from the more public room into a more secluded space. If he'd visited, he'd have had his throne in here and he would have sat probably against this wall and received visitors. It's the source of the modern term drawing room. This next room was simply known as the anteroom. This was a room for the king and the duke and the other important guests to come and have a more private conversation away from the rest of the court. Then we reach the culmination of these rooms, which is the state bedchamber. It's by far the most lavishly decorated of them all. And the king, if he had come here, would have received guests from his bed.
When this house was built, the king's bed was the most important spot in the kingdom. This was a world in which seeing the king getting dressed was the highest honour a man could hope for.
The last room was known as the cabinet. It would have been the king's office if he'd stayed, and from here he would have had to rule the country. But looking back from this room, along the suite of rooms that I've just walked through, we see what is known as the enfilade, all the doors in perfect alignment. And at the far end there's a mirror, which gives the impression that there's another set of apartments equally big on the other side.
It just emphasises that everything here was for show. Formality was a way of life. Every action, every step was controlled by rigid etiquette, all enforced by the architecture itself. This strange concept of a best room, if you like, which you never actually used, passed into the British way of life. These state apartments are the ancestor of the drawing rooms and Sunday parlours of the Victorian terraced house. There was, however, somewhere to escape the oppressive atmosphere, for some time alone, or even to meet that special someone, and that was the garden. Garden historian Jane Owen has been finding out about how formal gardens were an integral part of life in a Baroque country house.
Here we are in West Park, Bedfordshire. Great house, but I'm not here for that. I'm here for the landscape, which includes a very beautiful and unusual chunk of early 18th century garden. And that's the point about all these houses and gardens. They're completely interrelated. If you understand one, you understand the other. At the heart of the original grounds at Rest is a formal garden. Symmetry was as important here as inside the house. It's the same formal world view. In the late 17th century, neat geometry utterly tamed the landscape, showing this family's power over nature itself. This is the canal, or long water, with the Thomas Archer Pavilion at its far end. They are absolutely enormous. Very difficult to get an idea of the scale because they're so beautifully in proportion. The canal was a very fashionable Dutch feature, and it was also a political statement. It was one way this Whig family could tell the world, we support William of Orange. The Glorious Revolution hadn't just brought a king over from Holland, it had brought the latest continental fashion in water features. On either side was a new kind of garden, much less formal and much more enjoyable. There were a series of carefully cut woodland walks called rides, which gave the garden here at Rest a completely different aspect and also revealed crucial details about how these gardens were actually used. What about the layout of this park?
Well, the family started with the canal and really worked outwards. And so flanking it on either side is this fantastic woodland garden. And it is called a garden, they call it the Great Garden, which has these rides in it that you can walk down. And then it opens out every now and again into these glorious kind of rooms.
Ah, so this is one of the garden rooms?
It is indeed. This is one that was called the Duchess's Square. As you can see, it's now oval. But it's been returned slightly to its 18th century look, though. It's very heavily clipped, and that would have been very expensive to maintain. And so it's another way of the family showing people how much money they had, how much power, but also just how much taste, because that was what was fashionable.
And what would happen in these garden rooms? Would you have picnics? What would go on?
Well, you can see it's actually quite quiet when we're in here, and it's very private because the hedges are actually carefully designed to be above head height. You can't really see out, nobody can really see in. You could come here and read, you could come here and just relax, or you could have business meetings, or indeed discuss politics very quietly.
And what about this dear little building?
This is one of the half rounds. It's a kind of little brick-built pavilion. And we're a long way from the house here. If it suddenly rains, we'll be absolutely stuck. So it's an ideal place to shelter in, and also keeps the shade off on a sunny day.
But the garden wasn't just about a display of taste or even power. It made life in a Baroque house livable. In the formal house, the family were always surrounded by servants and guests. If they wanted a bit of privacy, they had to go outside. And I think a lot of the buildings in the grounds were actually built so they had somewhere for romantic rendezvous.
Well, this is the Thomas Archer Pavilion. It's effectively a summer house, but it's far larger than most people's houses. It would have been used for teas and meals. There's a kitchen here, so that much we know. But I'm interested in what else it was used for, particularly because there are some rather mysterious, intimate little rooms at the tops of spiral staircases. It begs the question.
Within 100 years, the kind of informality that was being road-tested in these overblown summer houses would revolutionise life in the main house itself.
The main thing that stood in the way of country house living loosening its tie and chilling out was the king. The etiquette of the court set the tone for these miniature royal courts across the face of England. But the story of the country house is also the story of the gradual disappearance of the king from the equation. Anna Kay has been visiting the houses of two prime ministers to see how aspirations changed for country house builders from the days of Elizabeth I to the 1720s.
Politicians were usually self-made men in a world of inherited wealth, and when they built, it was to try to cement their position within the old aristocracy. This is Burley, built by William Cecil in the 1570s and 80s out of the money he made as Elizabeth I's chief minister.
It's pretty impressive.
Cecil owed his political position to the Queen's favour and nothing else. His house is meant to show him off as a modern, educated man, and in the Elizabethan age, that meant touches of neoclassicism. Ancient Rome was back in style.
Jules, we think of Cecil as an administrator, a politician, and yet he's building this enormous, great big country house. What's he trying to achieve with this?
Well, he's a new-made man, and so he's making his mark by building this extraordinary building.
Looking around us, it strikes me that this is a fantastically modern building for the 1580s.
Yes, very much. He's using all these classical motifs up in the chimneys, classical columns and things like that.
The chimneys are actually columns, aren't they?
Yeah. But at the same time, this is really like a monastery cloister or an Oxbridge college or something like that. It's really very traditional, very medieval.
Actually, it's interesting to say that, because just up there you can see the roof of the Great Hall, which is sort of disguised behind this classical veneer, but it's actually the sort of seminal bit of a medieval building.
That's right. And then all these columns up there are in fact chimneys. And when the family was in residence, they'd have all been smoking. And that was a traditional emblem of the great man, of the great family, that kept all the fires burning.
Cecil had an ulterior motive. He was really building to please the Queen, his boss. His house was meant to help him retain royal favour.
There's no doubt that houses like Burley were built with the possibility of Elizabeth visiting in mind. She spent almost every year a several-month period on a progress throughout the country, staying with her courtiers, putting them to huge expense in entertaining her.
Elizabeth never actually came to Burley, but what Cecil built here did its job. He remained Elizabeth's chief minister until his death.
So despite its dramatically modern exterior, Burley is fundamentally a medieval building, and William Cecil a medieval type of politician, dependent on the Queen for his office and his power. But in the next 100 years, politics would change dramatically, and with it, the buildings in which politicians lived.
This is Houghton Hall in Norfolk, built in the 1720s by a very different kind of politician. Sir Robert Walpole was the first Prime Minister in the modern sense, ruling with a parliamentary majority, not just on the say-so of the King. He too had come from the minor gentry to a position of enormous power. And he too chose to express his new position in the world with a house.
We're in a bit of a different world in here, aren't we?
Yes, this is completely overwhelming. It's awesome. And particularly if you imagine somebody entering this place from the outside, and you are just simply overwhelmed by its height and its size and grandeur.
I mean, the little bits of classical ornament that we saw at Burley have now become a kind of whole, totally overwhelming scheme, not a sort of an adornment to essentially a medieval building.
That's right. This is the full Roman style. And Robert Walpole himself, over the mantelpiece, is dressed in a Roman toga. He is presenting himself as a Roman senator, and he's also presenting himself as the leader of a new empire, of the British Empire, which succeeds the Roman Empire in its power and strength.
So, Jules, what kind of things are happening in these rooms?
Well, the house was really only used twice a year, when the Prime Minister came up here and held these things called the Norfolk Congresses, basically for his political cronies at that particular time. They used to go hunting, then they would come home, and here there's perhaps the very first dining room in this country, and they would sit down and they would tuck into fantastic feasts. His son describes these people sitting around, carving into their roast beef and the blood sort of dripping down their chops, and they would drink themselves silly there.
Haddon Hall had seen the invention of the bedroom. Now at Houghton, Walpole was building a dining room, a library, a salon, rooms which hadn't existed 100 years before. He used this house for himself, to cement his political alliances through hospitality, and the King didn't even get a look in.
So what Walpole was doing here at Houghton was rather different from Cecil at Burley. He was building a house which was really about his own entertainment, about his own pursuits, not about having the Queen to stay or having occasions of state staged here. But when you get down to basics, what Cecil and what Walpole were doing was really very similar. They were both self-made men. They rose from relative obscurity to become the great statesmen of their age. And what they were trying to do was somehow to capture some of that, to be able to pass it on to their successors. And the form which they both chose was the country house.
As Walpole showed, a new kind of life was being lived inside the country house, and a new style was coming which would set the new way of living in stone.
Chatsworth was the pinnacle of British Baroque, but within a generation it had become deeply unfashionable. An architectural revolution had swept the country, and Palladianism became the style of the 18th century. the 1760s, it was through this great Corinthian arch that you'd have got your first glimpse of Stowe House. It was the place where you came up the avenue to get a window on the extraordinarily lavish world of the Temple Grenvilles. The house, and particularly the grounds, were open to the public right from the beginning. The family even built a little inn just over there for visitors to stay in. You could buy a guidebook when you turned up at the front door. And it all reminds me of that moment in Pride and Prejudice when Elizabeth Bennet is caught out by Mr. Darcy secretly visiting his house as a punter. The entrance to the house actually wasn't through this archway. It was round the back, which gave you the opportunity to see yet more of the landscape, yet more of the monuments, before actually reaching the front door. The country house was now at the peak of its influence. In the Georgian age, they literally became the powerhouses of the nation, wholly eclipsing the boring and Germanic royal court. It was in these great houses that real political power lay. In 1733, Lord Cobham, the owner of Stowe, perhaps the second richest man in England, fell out with the Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. He was in disgrace. What did he do? Well, he built. He put together the most impressive house in Britain, surrounded by a unique set of garden buildings.
So this building was built as a result of a falling out between Lord Cobham and Walpole.
Yes.
And it was christened a Temple of Friendship.
This is the Temple of Friendship. And this is where he entertained his friends. It's actually got a kitchen underneath, so he could have feasts.
Why choose a field in the middle of Buckinghamshire to put your great country house?
Well, I mean, it's the way the system worked. They didn't do it because they wanted to create a beautiful landscape garden for tourists to come and visit 200 years later. They did it for political reasons. They did it because they wanted to demonstrate their power and their wealth. The system depended on being able to buy votes from the localities in order to get yourself or your followers returned to Parliament. And it depended entirely on impressing people in remote spots like Buckinghamshire. So the alderman of Buckingham would think that their man, Lord Cobham in this case, was somebody who would eloquently represent them in the councils of the great back in London.
Stowe was designed in an architectural style we know today as Palladian. Essentially, this meant that it imitated the architecture of the Roman Republic, whose inheritance the country house builders wished to claim. This room just simply must be one of the largest and most successful, actually, neoclassical interiors in Britain. I mean, a room where they're actually trying to recreate a chunk of ancient Rome.
As soon as people started visiting Rome, they saw it, they wanted to bring it home in some way or another, or try to recreate it. And you can see it here in this space. If you just listen to the sound, it sounds echoey, it sounds ancient. If you look at the columns, for instance, you know, they're a replica marble, so it looks like ancient Roman columns. It echoes that kind of grandeur of ancient Rome.
They were trying to say a lot about themselves.
They want to say, look at me, I understand this, I'm important because I understand it, I can replicate it, but more importantly, I can remake antiquity, say something about me.
The men who built Stowe were the richest, the most successful, the most powerful men of their age. I mean, there must have been an element of them seeing themselves as sort of great Roman generals.
The country house was the powerhouse. You know, London was, if you like, the backwater at this time. Everybody lived in their grand country seats. This is where all the political machinations took place. So definitely these guys felt, yeah, I'm as important as a Roman general or a Roman emperor. Come and look at me in my wonderful house, come and circulate through the spaces, and come and really experience how grand I am.
In the brave new world of Palladian architecture, life in the country house was becoming less rigid. Etiquette was still important, but now in the evening, rooms would be set out for less formal entertainment. There'd be dancing in one room, food in another, maybe a harp recital, and lots of gambling and card playing. The first good roads since the Romans were being built, which meant that people could come for dinner and not have to stay for a week. But whatever the changes, these houses were still doing the same job, advancing a family's career.
With extraordinary social dexterity, the owners of Stowe propelled themselves in a little under 200 years from being sheep farmers to being dukes. The way they got there wasn't with the sword, wasn't with the pen, it was with the mason's trowel. It was through architecture.
Britain is a nation whose destiny was shaped for centuries by what went on in the attention-grabbing, career-advancing, bank-balance-destroying country house. Out of the egos of aristocrats came one of our unique architectural works of art. One of the things I think is incredibly significant is that these houses are still intact. In other countries, the big house was often a symbol of oppression, their contents looted by revolutionaries and their lands dispersed. In Britain, they were part of the process that created our constitution and shaped our way of life. Only in the 20th century would their cultural influence finally wane. They still represent a powerful strand in Britain's psyche.
And the most telling thing is that even today, when people have made it, they want to live in a country house.
Next time, I'll be discovering how London's economic muscle transformed Britain's towns and cities and gave birth to the modern metropolis.